So while we're waiting on Joe to complete his post on ethics, I think I'm just going to stick in a quick little 2 cents here regarding a conversation that I'm currently having about scriptural realities. What does it mean to believe what the scripture says? How do we interpret scriptures that don't necessarily make any sense or don't that are obviously from one point of view, that are coming with things that don't really work out historically? What do we do with that? I think it's a very important thing to take a look at, and I hope not to spend too long on it here. It could spend a very long time. This is an important subject. But what I do want to say is that these are stories of historical people or literary people, if you really want to pull some of them apart and say that they're not fully historically true. So be it. It doesn't matter. That's not the important piece. What is important to me, in my opinion, is the thought that these are stories that we can learn from. These are things that teach us about God. Now, we can be taught the wrong thing about God if we read them the wrong way. We can be taught that God has chosen people and the chosen people are better than the non-chosen people because whenever the Israelites go into Canaan, they kill all the Canaanites. And we could say, okay, whenever we feel like we're chosen by God, we should get rid of all those who are not chosen by God. This doesn't fit with the God of overall Scripture. This does not fit with the God who would create the world. This does not fit with a God that is love. It doesn't make sense. So, taking into account that that's not what makes sense, then we've got to come up with something different that does make sense. Well, that's pretty simple in this case. You're looking at the idea that what it means to be chosen is not what these Israelites took it to mean to be chosen. They took it to mean that what we're chosen, thus what we want we can take. Well, if we read about what it means to be chosen through Jesus' life and throughout Scripture, usually chosen means that you're chosen to serve, you're chosen to do a purpose. Thus, chosen by God means that they were to go in and help take care of and love and care for these people, not kill them all off. That's probably quite necessarily a misinterpretation of what God is saying by these people. Now, doesn't that mean that we also can misinterpret what God's saying and not understand it completely? Yes, exactly. That's the point. By understanding the struggles of faith that these other people are having, we give them their humanity. If we say that there is only one interpretation, we remove the humanity of these people and make them into very caricature-ish existences. That here is this person that is nothing more than a little literary piece that's to prove a point. These don't just prove points. These are actual struggles and actual people who are having actual issues with trying to be who God has called them to be and being who we are as created humans. That is what's going on throughout Scripture. With that in mind, I think it is very important that we admit that there are pieces of Scripture that aren't right. That we can't just say that because it's written in there and interpreted a certain way, that's the only way it should be interpreted. There's a lot to be said for historical interpretation. There's a lot to be said for the thought that people who have studied this for years have come up with ways that they think it fits. But it's not the only way. It's not necessarily the right way. We are called to continue the struggle. We are called to continue to be faithful, continue to discern, continue to try to understand who God is. That hasn't changed. Thus, what I am saying here is that I think it is important from both a Christian ethics point of view, a hermeneutical point of view, a just being a Christian point of view, to realize that we don't have all the answers of what Scripture means. I don't, you don't, no one does. We do not fully understand God. We do not fully understand what God was up to, but we can say certain things that we can learn from Scripture. That these are contextual. All the truths of Scripture are contextual. They may have universal truths within them, but how they're stated is at its core contextual because they were given at a certain time to a certain people. That is context. And with that in mind, I implore us all to take the time to really start to treat Scripture as something to struggle with. That it is important to struggle with these stories that make us uncomfortable instead of glossing them over. It is important to struggle with these thoughts that are currently in the world that might make you uncomfortable instead of glossing them over and saying Scripture says blah blah. Scripture doesn't say blah blah. Scripture says very diverse things about what it means to live as Christ, to live as a Christian, to live seeking God. And those things, that idea of faithfulness, is the key component that we have to treat. We have to view the world and all the characters of Scripture as people who are trying to do God's will within the context they were in and trying to understand who God is, just as we are. With that, later days. Looking forward to your stuff, Joe.